Why did this blind dog tear the wall behind a baby's crib? The truth is terrifying. Scratch the wall. At 2:07 a.m., the baby monitor was quiet. The night seemed still, and yet Koa moved. Blind and battered from his past as a police rescue dog, he'd never barked without cause. But tonight, he wouldn't stop. He clawed at the wall, growled. His paws bled, and just as Marco rose to pull him away, they heard it, a hum, like a whisper of wings. Behind that wall, something was alive, and it wasn't supposed to be there. This is the true story of what a blind dog knew, what a family almost lost, and how one unlikely hero proved that vision isn't always what saves us. The metal gate clanged shut behind Leah Bennett with a hollow finality, echoing down the corridor lined with kennels. The sound startled a few dogs into frenzied barking, but one near the far end remained still. The shelter smelled of bleach, wet fur, and something heavier underneath, like old grief that had soaked into concrete floors. Leah held a small box of donated chew toys, blankets, and unopened bags of puppy food against her chest as she made her way past barking mutts and soulful eyes. Most dogs threw themselves at the fences, tails wagging, tongues lolling, desperate for touch, for escape. But not the German shepherd in Kennel 24. He sat rigid in the back corner, silent, his head tilted slightly like he was listening to something no one else could hear. His eyes, both milky with cataracts, looked straight ahead. Yet something in the way his ears twitched when Leah passed made her pause. A nameplate hung on his gate. KOA, MSAR 7YRs, special handling. In smaller font, do not approach without staff. Leah shifted her box and crouched, just out of reach of the gate. "Hi there," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. "You don't want to bark like the others?" No response. Not even a turn of the head. But his ears flicked once. A shelter volunteer in her 20s approached from the side. "You're the one who called about donations? That's sweet of you." "Yeah." Leah stood up slowly. "Just wanted to help a little. I used to work with rescue dogs years ago. Thought I'd stop by while running errands." The young woman glanced toward Kennel 24, her expression tightening. "That one's not adoptable. At least that's what most folks say." Leah raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "His name's Koa. He was a canine rescue dog. Lost his sight in a fire at an orphanage. Saved a bunch of kids. After that, something changed. He doesn't lash out, but he won't let anyone near him except one staff member. Won't eat if you watch him. Doesn't respond to toys or commands, just waits." "Waits for what?" "Maybe for his handler," the girl said quietly. "The one who died in the fire." A silence settled between them. Leah turned back to the dog. He hadn't moved. Most people would have walked away. Leah should have. After all, she was 7 months pregnant, exhausted, and still recovering from the emotional minefield of preparing for a baby after years of failed IVF attempts. But something about Koa, the stillness, the restraint in his posture, the absence of begging, reached a place inside her that hadn't stirred in months. "Can I try talking to him?" she asked. The volunteer hesitated. "Don't open the gate, and speak low. He doesn't like loud voices." Leah nodded and crouched again. "Koa," she whispered, "I don't know what you've seen, but I know what it's like to carry silence like a shield." Still nothing. She reached out with her voice like a thread. "I know you've lost someone. I know what it's like to feel useless, broken, like the world has no place for what you've become." Koa turned his head, just slightly. But it was enough. Leah inhaled softly, her throat tightening. She stayed there for another minute before finally standing. "He heard me." The volunteer's voice was hushed. "Yeah, that's the most he's responded in days." By the time Leah returned to the lobby, a small storm of questions spun through her mind. She didn't plan on getting a dog, especially not now, not with a baby so close to arriving. Marco had made that very clear the last time she brought up the idea. But logic couldn't smother what she felt in that moment. Not pity, not hero worship. It was recognition. Koa wasn't just broken. He was still watching, still listening, still waiting. And Leah Bennett was no longer sure she could leave him behind. The sky was soft gray by the time Leah pulled into the gravel driveway, the last light of day catching on the porch railings like a quiet warning. Wind tugged at the chimes above the entryway. They didn't sing, they clattered, off-key, unsettled. Marco was already home, leaning against the doorframe in his work jacket, sleeves rolled to the elbows. His hair was still damp from the garage shower, his hands stained with oil from the brake job he hadn't wanted to take but couldn't afford to turn down. Leah stepped out of the car, her expression unreadable. She cradled her belly with one hand as she walked toward the house, the other gripping the folded flyer the shelter girl had handed her just before she left. Without preamble, she said, "His name is Koa." Marco squinted. "Who?" "The dog I told you about, the one at the Rainford shelter." Marco's jaw tightened before she even finished the sentence. "Leah. He's a retired canine, blind, but he saved 12 kids from a fire at an orphanage." "That's awful," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "And it still doesn't change anything." Leah moved past him, into their modest kitchen where the scent of slow-cooker stew lingered. She didn't sit, just turned to face him across the countertop. "I wasn't going to say anything, but I went there today." "I saw him." Marco sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Abs, we've been over this. We've got enough going on. You're 7 months along. The last thing we need is a traumatized animal, let alone one who can't even see." Leah's voice didn't rise, but it hardened. "You didn't see how he moved, how still he was, like he was waiting for someone, not begging, just listening." "You want to bring that kind of unpredictability into a house with a newborn?" Marco asked, exasperated. "We're barely sleeping as it is. You think a blind, broken ex-police dog is what we're missing right now?" Leah swallowed, her thumb unconsciously rubbing the edge of the flyer. "I don't think he's broken," she said quietly. "I think he's grieving." "That makes 2 of you," Marco snapped, then immediately looked away, shame creeping up his neck. "Leah, I didn't mean that." But it was too late. The air between them cooled like a door slamming. Leah placed the flyer gently on the table between them. On it was Koa's photo ears sharp, eyes cloudy, posture proud despite his blindness. The caption beneath read, "Koa 7Y O German Shepherd, retired SAR unit, lost his handler in the line of duty. Suitable only for experienced adopters. Special needs, special heart." "You remember when we thought we couldn't have Isla?" Leah said after a moment. "When every doctor said no, every month came back blank, and we just existed, like grief was part of our daily routine?" Marco didn't answer, just nodded, barely. "That's how he looked, Marco. Like someone who's been waiting too long to matter again." "I'm not heartless," he said, softer now. "But a baby and a blind dog, What if he missteps? What if he lashes out? Leah's voice broke slightly. What if he's the only one who won't? Silence hung for a long beat. Then she pulled out her phone and scrolled to a message. The shelter manager called after I left. She said Koa doesn't react to most people. But when I spoke, he turned his head. First time in weeks. Marco looked at her, truly looked past the swelling curve of her belly, past the tired lines on her face, into the part of her that had once fostered dogs without hesitation. Before the heartbreak, before the miscarriages, before life turned cautious. You've already made up your mind, haven't you? He asked. I think maybe he's not the one who needs saving, Leah whispered. Maybe we are. Back at the shelter, the kennels were quieter than usual. Lights dimmed, shadows long. Koa lay curled in his corner, his ears twitching slightly when the metal latch clicked open. The shelter worker entered with her phone still in hand. Looks like you've got a visitor coming back tomorrow morning, she murmured. Koa didn't lift his head, but his tail thumped once against the cold concrete floor, just once, as if he already knew. The back door of the shelter creaked open, and for the first time in weeks, Koa stepped into the light. Not sunlight. It was overcast that morning, the kind of sky that couldn't decide between rain or mercy. But even the soft gray felt warmer than the fluorescent hum of his kennel. Leah waited beside their aging Subaru, one hand resting on her rounded belly, the other clutching a worn nylon leash. Her heart pounded with a rhythm she hadn't felt in months. Not fear, exactly, something deeper, like holding your breath just before stepping into cold water you know you need. Koa didn't pull. He didn't hesitate either. He simply walked beside the shelter worker, ears forward, head high. Clouded eyes pointed straight ahead like he still remembered what forward meant, even if he couldn't see it. Marco stood by the passenger door, arms crossed, saying nothing. You sure about this? The staffer asked one last time, her hand lingering on Koa's collar. No, Leah answered honestly. But I think he is. With a quiet nod, the worker handed over the leash. The moment Leah took it, Koa stilled. His body went alert, not tense, not fearful, just aware. Like something had shifted. Like he recognized something familiar. She opened the back hatch and laid down a thick folded quilt beside a new water bowl. Here's your spot, she whispered, giving the leash a gentle tug. Koa stepped up, turned once, and settled facing the window, but oriented toward the front seat. Their home sat at the edge of a tree-lined cul-de-sac in a modest Rainford neighborhood where mailboxes tilted and porch lights flickered, but everyone still waved. It wasn't big, 3 bedrooms, cracked tile in the hallway. The kind of place you picked because it felt like it could hold a future, even if that future still trembled in your hands. Marco unlocked the front door and stepped aside as Leah guided Koa inside. The dog didn't rush. He didn't sniff wildly or pace nervously like most rescues. Instead, he paused at the threshold, nose lifting subtly into the air. Then he moved forward with quiet precision. Left turn, couch, pause, coffee table sidestep. Hardwood creaked beneath his paws as he navigated the living room like he was mapping it in real time. With no eyes to see, he seemed to feel the space like a sixth sense. Marco watched from the hallway, jaw tight. He's memorizing it, isn't he? Leah nodded, awe softening her voice. Yeah, like a soldier walking through a perimeter. Koa padded over to a wall, stopped exactly before the baby gate, and sat. The nursery was on the other side. Leah blinked. "We haven't even shown him that room yet." Later that afternoon, Marco busied himself in the garage fixing nothing in particular, while Leah sat cross-legged on the living room floor with a bowl of kibble and an open notebook. "Koa," she said clearly, not loudly. "Sit." He didn't move, just stood calmly a few feet away. She tried again. "Koa, sit." He cocked his head slightly, not confused, listening. Leah took a single piece of kibble and tapped it gently on the hardwood. "Sit." This time, he did. Not because he wanted the food, but because her tone shifted. Gentle, sure, like a tuning fork finally struck the right note. They repeated the process with down, stay, and come. No clicker, no treats shoved in his face, just a woman with a round belly and a notebook full of trust. She didn't notice how much time had passed until the sky dimmed and her feet began to tingle from sitting too long. When she stood, Koa followed her, not by command, but by instinct. At the doorway to the nursery, he paused again. Leah opened the gate slowly. "It's okay. Come in." The crib was already set up, curtains hand-sewn with tiny constellations. The mobile above the changing table spun gently from the draft leaking through an old window. Koa entered like he'd been there before. He circled once, stopped near the crib, and lay down facing the door. His head didn't turn toward the mobile, or the curtains, or the soft carpet. He just rested his chin on his paws and exhaled. A deep, almost human sound. Not exhaustion. Permission. That night, as they got ready for bed, Marco watched from the hallway as Leah settled under the sheets. Koa was lying just outside their bedroom door, his body curled but alert. "He hasn't barked once," Marco murmured. "He doesn't need to," Leah said. "He's listening." Marco hesitated, then finally asked, "What if we made a mistake?" Leah reached for his hand under the blanket. "We've made plenty." "This isn't one of them." Down the hall, Koa's ears twitched as the heater clicked on. A floorboard groaned near the nursery. He didn't rise, but his body went still. His eyes, though blind, opened, and he waited. Not for food, not for praise, just for the sound of something breaking the peace he'd decided to guard. The night Isla Bennett was born, the moon hung low over Rainford, swollen and golden, like it too was holding its breath. Inside room 304 of St. Gabriel's Medical Center, Leah clutched Marco's hand with a grip that didn't loosen, even when the nurse whispered, "Just one more push." Her eyes never left the ceiling tiles, counting cracks between fluorescent lights like they were seconds of pain she had to endure. She had waited for this for years, through injections, ultrasounds, heartbreak, and hope, until she no longer dared to believe this moment would come. Then she cried out, not in agony, but in release. And a voice, louder than hers, filled the room. One sharp, defiant cry, then another. 10 fingers, the nurse murmured, smiling. 10 toes, and a set of lungs that'll make sure the world hears her. Marco laughed through his tears. Leah just crumpled into the pillow, whispering over and over, "She's here. She's really here." They named her Isla Hope Bennett, because hope, like Isla, had arrived even when it seemed impossible. 3 days later, the front door creaked open. The house felt somehow smaller, quieter, more fragile. Leah stepped in first, holding Isla tightly to her chest, swaddled in a soft peach blanket stitched with tiny wildflowers. Koa was waiting. He sat near the hallway, his body alert but still, as if he'd known to be exactly there, exactly then. His ears flicked at the smallest sounds. The rustle of fabric, the hiccup of newborn breath, the way Leah's footsteps faltered just before crossing the threshold. Marco carried in the bags. "Easy now," he said under his breath. "Let's just see how he reacts." Leah knelt slowly, her body still tender from the delivery, and rested a hand on Koa's thick fur. "Koa," she whispered, "this is Isla. She's our baby." Koa didn't move forward. He didn't whine or wag his tail, but his head tilted ever so slightly, and his nose twitched in the direction of the bundle. Then gently, like a veteran soldier reporting for duty, he backed away 2 steps and lay down, facing the baby, watching, listening, guarding. The first night was a blur of exhaustion and awe. Isla's cries shattered the silence at midnight, then again at 2:40 a.m., then again at 4:05. Leah moved through the house like a sleepwalker, feeding, changing, shushing. Her body ached, her mind swam, but her heart was fuller than it had ever known. Koa never entered the room, but he was always there. Each time Leah stepped out with Isla in her arms, Koa was waiting just outside the nursery door. Ears pricked, head lifted, never intrusive, never needy, just present. Marco noticed it on the second night. "He hasn't slept." "He will," Leah murmured, "when she does." On the third night, Leah sat in the nursery rocker, Isla's tiny fingers curled around the edge of her shirt. Her eyelids drooped, milk-drunk and dreaming. Outside the window a wind stirred the branches. One tapped the glass with soft rhythm, like nature had come to bless the child. Koa shifted positions outside the door. His nails made the faintest click on the hardwood. That was the only sound he allowed himself. Leah watched him through the open door. His body was always between Isla and the hallway, between her crib and the rest of the world. "You know," she whispered, not sure if she was speaking to the dog or to herself, "you don't have to stay there." Koa didn't move. She smiled faintly. "But you're going to anyway, aren't you?" By the end of the week, their rhythm had formed, not perfect, but real. Marco handled the dishes and the late-night bottle prep. Leah did the feedings and early morning rocking. Koa did the watching, the waiting, the invisible work no one asked of him, but he gave anyway. And not once did he bark. Neighbors came by with casseroles and flowers. Aunts and co-workers dropped off soft toys and knitted socks. Everyone cooed over Isla, but it was Koa who never blinked when she cried. Koa who tensed when a door slammed too hard. Koa who lifted his head every time the baby monitor popped. They didn't ask him to. He just knew. On the 7th night, Leah finally managed to get Isla to sleep by 10:30. She walked to the hallway and leaned against the wall, watching Koa as he lay on the rug outside the nursery. His head was down, his breathing slow, but she could tell he wasn't asleep. He was simply at ease, quiet, in control, present. "Hey," she whispered. Koa lifted his head. "Thank you." She wasn't sure he heard the words, but something in his ears flicked. And his tail, resting beside him, moved once, barely a twitch. But it was enough. It began on the 3rd night, sometime after 2 a.m., the kind of hour when the world slips into stillness so deep it feels sacred. The rain had stopped. Isla was finally asleep, and for the first time since the delivery, Leah dared to think they might just have this under control. Then Koa growled. Not a whimper, Not a bark, a low, warning growl that curled out from his chest like thunder from deep beneath the earth. Leah sat bolt upright in bed. She'd only just drifted off, still in yesterday's sweatshirt, Isla's burp cloth in one hand. "What is it?" she whispered into the dark. From his spot outside the nursery, Koa didn't move. He only growled again, louder this time. His body tensed, every muscle engaged, pointed not toward the door but toward something inside the nursery. Leah reached for the baby monitor. The soft green glow showed Isla asleep, arms curled beside her head like folded wings. No movement, no cries, just the faint rise and fall of her tiny chest. Koa rose. Then, to Leah's shock, he walked into the nursery. He never crossed that threshold without invitation. Never, not once. "Marco," she whispered, nudging her husband. "Something's wrong." Marco groaned. "It's probably a raccoon outside. Or maybe he needs to pee." "He's not at the door," she said. "He's in Isla's room." That got him sitting up. They moved quickly, half asleep and barefoot, Leah clutching her robe, Marco still pulling on a t-shirt as they reached the nursery. The light from the hallway spilled in and revealed Koa standing rigid in the middle of the room, hackles raised, ears locked forward. He was staring at the wall behind the crib. Then he lunged. "Whoa!" Marco stepped forward just as Koa leapt at the wallpapered wall, claws raking downward with frantic urgency. The floral-patterned delicate vines on a cream background tore beneath his paws. Strips of paper fluttered to the floor like wounded petals. His claws made scritching sounds, sharp and fast, as if he were trying to dig through solid wood. "Hey! Koa no! What the hell are you doing?" Marco shouted, lunging to grab his collar. Koa snapped his head sideways, not to bite, not to threaten, but to dodge. Then he went right back to digging. Blood speckled the wall. His nails had torn, the pink skin beneath ripped raw. "Stop it!" Marco barked, furious now. "You're going to wake the baby!" But Isla didn't stir. Somehow, impossibly, she slept through it all. Leah's breath caught as she stepped closer. Koa wasn't just clawing, he was targeting. His paws hit one specific spot again and again, directly behind the head of Isla's crib. "Koa," she whispered, voice trembling. "What are you trying to tell us?" Marco shook his head, exasperated. "He's confused, Leah. He's blind. Probably thinks he hears something that isn't there." But the moment Marco reached for Koa again, the dog turned not with fear, but with something far more desperate, pleading. He looked at Leah, ears back, panting now from exertion and pain, but still he clawed, still he insisted, and that's when Leah heard it. Faint, muffled, wrong. A sound like buzzing. Her breath hitched. "Marco." "What?" "Do you hear that?" They both froze. And then it came again, faint, buried deep within the wall, a low rhythmic hum, not mechanical, not electrical, alive. "Oh my God," Marco breathed, stepping back from the crib. Leah dropped to her knees beside Koa, whose paws were now streaked with crimson. She pressed her ear to the damaged wallpaper. The buzzing was louder now, uneven, like a swarm shifting restlessly behind a curtain. Without another word, Leah grabbed the loose edge of wallpaper and pulled. It peeled away in jagged strips, revealing discolored plaster beneath. Koa stepped back, panting hard, blood trailing behind him. But he didn't stop watching that wall. Behind the plaster, a faint vibration pulsed through the air. And then a shadow moved behind the thin layer. Leah's stomach flipped. There was something inside. 10 minutes later, they stood in the kitchen, Leah pressing gauze to Koa's paws while Marco paced, phone in hand trying to get through to emergency services. "No, we didn't remove the wall yet," he said into the receiver. Yes, we think it's a hive, possibly hornets or Africanized bees. No, we didn't know until now. Our baby sleeps next to that wall. Can you just send someone, please?" He hung up and exhaled. "They're sending a unit." Leah didn't answer. Her hands worked silently, cleaning blood from Koa's fur. Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. She leaned in close, pressing her forehead to his. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew before we did." Koa didn't move, but his tail, despite the pain, thumped once against the cabinet. The fire truck arrived in the cold stillness before dawn. Its red and white lights danced across the Bennett family's front windows, casting long, flickering shadows across the nursery hallway. Rainford was a small town. Calls like this didn't come often, but when they did, they came heavy, even in silence. Leah opened the door barefoot, hair pulled into a loose bun, Isla asleep in a sling across her chest. Marco stood just behind her, rubbing a trembling hand across the back of his neck. Koa lay near the base of the stairs, wrapped in an old towel, his paws freshly bandaged, but raw beneath. Despite everything, his ears remained tuned forward, focused toward the nursery, toward the danger he still hadn't stopped guarding. The fire captain stepped inside, helmet tucked under one arm. "You the ones who heard the buzzing in the wall?" "Yes," Marco said. "Our dog found it. He wouldn't stop." The captain eyed Koa. "German Shepherd?" "Was a K9, Leah answered softly. "Lost his sight." But apparently not his instincts. The firefighter knelt down beside the nursery wall, flashlight scanning over the torn wallpaper and cracked plaster. The hum was louder now, undeniable, angry. He pressed a palm against the surface. "It's warm," he muttered. "We need to breach it." They worked quickly but carefully, peeling back strips of plaster, one layer at a time, like surgeons excavating a secret the house had kept too long. The first piece fell away with a dull crack. Then the room filled with sound, a deep, living buzz, sickening in its intensity. The wall itself seemed to pulse with it. Every square inch behind that nursery panel was crawling. "Oh my God," Marco breathed. The hive spilled out in slow, sinister movement, black gold, twitching, alive. A swarming mass of Africanized bees, so densely packed they looked like shadows clothed in sound. The firefighter backed up immediately. "We need to clear the house now." Leah tightened her grip on Isla. "Go," the captain ordered. "Take the baby. Take the dog. Close all doors behind you." Leah didn't wait. She grabbed Koa's leash with one hand, her daughter held tightly in the other, and led them to the back room. Marco stood frozen for a moment longer, watching those bees move, the slow horror of it sinking into his chest. The wall behind Isla's crib had been alive, and Koa had known. He turned to follow. They gathered in the kitchen, door to the nursery now shut and taped off by the crew, thick towels shoved under the base to prevent spread. Koa lay at Leah's feet, sides heaving slightly from exertion. Isla, somehow still asleep in the sling, clung to her mother's heartbeat like a metronome of safety. The fire captain approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "We've seen hives before," he said, "but nothing like this. Africanized bees are rare this far north, but it happens. When they settle in a wall cavity that close to a nursery—" He paused, choosing his words. "An adult would have gone to the ER. A newborn?" He didn't finish the sentence. The silence said enough. Leah reached down, her hand resting on Koa's head. He didn't lift it, but his ears moved at her touch. "He tried to warn us," she said softly. "We almost didn't listen." The fire captain looked from the bandaged dog to the woman holding the child. "Well," he said, voice quiet now, "thank God you did." An hour later, the crew had sealed the nursery door completely. It would remain off-limits until a professional apiary team arrived in the morning. Marco sat on the living room floor, knees bent, elbows resting on them. The coffee table still held an untouched bottle and 2 baby rattles. He stared at them like they didn't belong in the same house anymore. Leah placed a fresh bowl of water next to Koa, who lapped at it slowly, then returned to lying still. "He knew," Marco murmured. "From behind the wall." Leah nodded. "I thought he was dangerous," he added. "Unstable. I thought bringing him here was—" He trailed off. Koa's tail moved, just a single thump against the hardwood. Not playful, not eager, but deliberate. Marco glanced toward the hallway. Isla was 6 inches from that hive. Leah didn't respond. She didn't need to. That night, they didn't put Isla in the nursery. Her crib stayed in the master bedroom, close enough that Leah could hear every soft inhale. Marco had dragged in the rocking chair. Koa lay at the foot of the bed, paws still tender, body unmoving. At 2:07 a.m., Leah woke from a shallow sleep. She looked toward the crib. Koa was already sitting up, facing it, ears forward, still listening, still watching. The soft click of the kettle brought Leah back to the present. She stood in the kitchen, fingers wrapped loosely around a chipped mug while steam curled like ghosts above the rim. Outside, a drizzle tapped gently on the window pane, an early spring rain, quiet and cold. Koa lay in his usual place by the nursery door, facing it, ears relaxed but tilted just enough to catch any sound. Isla was asleep. The baby monitor crackled faintly on the counter beside Leah, white noise filtering through like static memories. But Leah wasn't watching the monitor. She was staring at her laptop screen. A headline stared back. "Canine hero saves 11 children from orphanage blaze. Handler in critical condition." Ranger, the article read. That was his former name. She blinked slowly, scrolling through a series of grainy news photos. Most were taken at night flames leaping into the sky behind barricades of fire trucks and flashing lights. A collapsed roof. Charred window frames. And then a shot that made her breath catch. A firefighter in full gear knelt beside a German shepherd, soot-streaked and trembling, his fur blackened around the muzzle, his eyes wide with fear. Another showed the dog dragging a blanket-wrapped child by the sleeve through an open doorway, embers falling like ash around them. Her hand rose to cover her mouth. She hadn't realized she was crying. The article was dated 3 years ago. Rainford County Orphanage. Electrical fire sparked after midnight. Most of the staff had already gone home. A skeleton crew remained, just 2 workers and 22 children, all under the age of 10. 11 didn't make it out, but 11 did because of a K9 unit stationed nearby on overnight patrol. Ranger, the German shepherd assigned to Officer Jackson Thorne, had entered the burning building multiple times, disobeying direct orders to stay back. Witnesses said he would run in, disappear into smoke, and return each time with a child. No hesitation, no fear, only instinct, only duty. Leah opened another tab. She searched for Jackson Thorne. A local obituary appeared, simple, respectful. Officer Jackson Reed Thorne, 34, passed away after sustaining internal injuries and smoke inhalation during the Rainford Orphanage fire. Survived by his wife Camille. No children. His final request, written in his will, "If Ranger outlives me, please place him with a family who needs him, and let it be one with a child." The words swam slightly on the screen as tears welled again. She could picture it now, Koa, then still Ranger, sitting beside a hospital bed that would never speak again. Loyal to silence, bound to a presence he could no longer sense, waiting for a command that would never come. They said he wouldn't leave the hospital hallway for 3 days, wouldn't eat, wouldn't respond, wouldn't move until they sedated him. And after that, he was never the same. Leah closed the laptop and leaned forward, pressing her forehead to the table. The rain had picked up outside, a slow rhythm like a heartbeat. She thought about the day she'd first seen Koa behind that cage, the way he hadn't barked like the others, the way he had sat in silence still, unreadable, but listening, always listening. Not broken, not wild, just waiting for the right voice, the right presence, the right child. The baby monitor crackled again, a soft murmur. Isla shifted in her crib, letting out a tiny sigh. Leah stood, brushing a tear from her cheek, and walked softly toward the nursery. Koa sensed her immediately, his head lifted. He didn't face her, couldn't. But she swore something about his posture softened, like he knew she carried something new in her hands. Something weightless. A truth unspoken, but understood. She knelt beside him. "Koa," she whispered, "you were never lost. You were waiting." His ears flicked once. "And now, you're home." That night, after Isla was fed and asleep again, Leah returned to the kitchen and wrote a note. "To Camille Thorne, I don't know if you'll read this, but I needed to thank you. Your husband was a hero, so is Koa. He saved our daughter's life this week, just like he did for those children. He still hears what we can't, still feels what's coming, still refuses to walk away. Sometimes I think maybe he didn't lose his vision. Maybe he just learned to see differently. We'll keep him safe, just like he keeps us. L." She folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the computer. Tomorrow, she would find Camille's address. But tonight, she walked down the hall, past the hum of the monitor, and into the living room, where Koa lay curled near the fireplace. She sat down beside him and whispered only 2 words. "Thank you." His tail moved barely, but it was enough. The next morning, the sky hung heavy with spring fog-muted gray, like someone had turned the world's brightness all the way down. Leah sat on the living room floor, a blanket wrapped around her legs, Isla asleep against her chest. Koa lay nearby, unmoving but awake, his ears twitching with every shift in the house, every tiny breath Isla took. The email had come in at 2:14 a.m. Subject, Koa, Ranger. "I believe he found you. It was from Camille Thorne." Leah had almost missed it in the sea of unread messages, but once she saw the name she couldn't look away. Camille's message was brief, restrained, like someone who'd spent years learning not to speak too soon. "Dear Leah, thank you for reaching out. I still think of him every day, both of them really. Ranger was my husband's soul in a different form. After the fire, I wasn't strong enough to keep him. He stopped eating, refused to leave Jackson's boots, I thought maybe he needed to forget. Now I see. He just needed to find the next voice that matched the one he lost. Attached is a voicemail Jackson left me the day before the fire. It's the last recording I have of him. It's yours now, too. Camille. Leah stared at the audio file for a long time before pressing play. It started with a rustle of static, the kind that made it feel like someone had cracked open time itself. Then, Jackson's voice, warm, worn, and filled with the kind of tired you only hear in people who've given everything. Hey, babe. I know you're probably already asleep, your 5 a.m. yoga goddess routine or whatever. Soft chuckle. Just needed to say something before I forget. We had a call at the orphanage again. False alarm. Some kid pulled a smoke detector thinking it'd be funny. But Ranger, he didn't treat it like a joke. Soon as that alarm went off, he was in. Didn't wait, didn't hesitate. Just ran. Pause. I tried to call him back, but he bolted toward the baby dorms. The lights were off. I didn't even realize a couple of the kids were still inside. He found them, all of them, huddled in a corner behind the toy shelf, like he could hear their fear through the damn walls. Softer now. Cam. He was never trained for this. Not like that. Not for smoke. Not for fire. Not for instincts that feel like prophecy. Another pause. If something ever happens to me, promise me one thing. Don't let them put him down. Don't let them cage him up like he's just a tool gone dull. He's more than that. He's not just a dog. He's a sentinel. If I'm gone, Koa must find a family with a child who needs him. That's where he belongs. That's where I want part of me to stay. And then the line went quiet. A beep. A system timestamp. Silence. Leah's cheeks were wet before she even realized she'd been crying. She looked down at Isla, nestled in her arms, tiny fists curled, lashes trembling in dream. And beside her, Koa still lay, ears pointed toward her, as if he'd heard the message too. He hadn't moved, but she could swear he was listening. Later that evening, after Marco got home, Leah played the voicemail again. They sat in the kitchen, Isla asleep in her crib, the lights dimmed low. The moment felt sacred, too fragile for anything louder than a whisper. Marco said nothing as the recording played. When it ended, he simply looked down at his hands. His knuckles were white from how hard he'd been gripping the edge of the table. "I knew him," he said, voice tight. "Not well, but enough." Leah turned to him slowly. "What?" Marco's jaw flexed. "I was working for the city inspection office. Got flagged about the orphanage's wiring months before the fire. I filed the report, recommended repairs, strongly. But no one wanted to fund it, said it wasn't urgent." He swallowed hard. "I should have pushed harder, should have made more noise. I told Jackson he was the only one who listened, said he'd keep an eye on it." Leah reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "This wasn't your fault," she said. Marco didn't respond, but under the table Koa slowly stood and walked over his gate a little stiff, as always. Without hesitation, he pressed his body against Marco's leg. Not demanding, not seeking, just there, silent, solid, forgiving. That night, Leah stood in the nursery doorway, watching Koa settle in his spot just outside Isla's crib. His head faced her, but his eyes, though unseeing, seemed directed toward something deeper, toward Jackson's voice still echoing in the corners of this house, toward the child he was meant to protect, toward the unspoken promise he was born to keep. The rain started around 2 a.m., a soft, hesitant tapping against the roof, as if the sky was unsure it had permission to cry. Marco sat alone in the living room, nursing a mug of untouched tea gone cold. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Leah and Isla were asleep upstairs. Koa lay nearby in the hallway, his body curled but his ears still half tilted toward Marco. The house was quiet, but Marco's thoughts were not. He had tried to forget, buried it beneath renovation plans and baby names, folded the memory into one of those mental drawers marked closed, and hoped it would stay shut. But Jackson's voice on that voicemail had cracked something open, something old, something unfinished, and now it was crawling back up from where he'd left it. He stood and paced toward the hallway, where Koa stirred but did not rise. The dog's eyes, fogged and blind, followed him with eerie accuracy. Marco stopped, looked down. "You remember him, don't you?" His voice was low, not meant to be heard by anyone but the night, and maybe the dog who somehow understood more than he should. Marco dropped to a crouch, resting on his haunches beside Koa. "I was the guy who signed the report," he whispered, "back when it was just paperwork. 4 years ago. He had been 31, barely a year into his job with the city's Safety Review Board. The orphanage Sunny Glen was on his inspection list for March. He'd found 2 exposed conduits in the attic and 3 scorched sockets in the dorm wing. When he'd asked the director about repairs, she'd offered a tight-lipped smile and said, "We're aware." He flagged it as a moderate risk. Recommended rewiring within 6 months. Not urgent, but notable. He even called Jackson the next day. They had met once, briefly, when Marco was researching canine safety training. He remembered Jackson as kind, blunt, always with one hand resting near the shepherd's back. "I just thought you should know," Marco had said over the phone, "in case you're still running drills there." "Thanks," Jackson replied, after a long pause. "That building's a matchbox. I'll be careful." And then, less than 8 weeks later, the orphanage burned. 11 kids survived. Because of a dog. Because of this dog. But Jackson didn't, and Marco had lived with that weight ever since. "I should have yelled louder," he said, now resting his palms on his knees, knuckles tight. Koa shifted, just enough to press his side gently against Marco's leg. Not sudden, not dramatic, just present, just knowing. And it broke something in Marco that had stayed sealed for far too long. "I didn't know how to be the guy who demanded things," he said softly. "Didn't want to get labeled as difficult. I thought I was being smart, respectful." He let out a dry laugh, bitter at the edges. "I thought I had time." Koa didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence was enough, a silent witness, a quiet absolution. In the hush of that early morning hour, Marco didn't feel judged. He felt seen, and somehow forgiven. When Leah came down just after dawn, robe drawn tight, her hair still wild from sleep, she found them like that. Marco sitting on the floor, Koa pressed against him. No words, just a man finally laying down a guilt he'd carried too long, and a dog who had been waiting for him to do so. Later, over breakfast, Marco shared the whole story. Leah didn't interrupt, just held his hand when he paused. Her eyes were soft, wet, but soft. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said. He nodded, then looked down at Koa, who now lay beside Isla's crib upstairs. That dog, he murmured, has been watching over her like she's made of glass. Leah smiled faintly. Maybe he thinks she's the second chance he never got to give. That afternoon, as sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days, Marco went to the shed. He pulled out a small plank of cedar, sanded the edges smooth, and carved a single word into the surface with his pocket knife. Sentinel. That night he mounted it above Koa's bed. The dog couldn't see it, but somehow when Marco whispered, "For you," Koa lifted his head and let his tail thump once against the floor. The morning news crackled softly from the kitchen radio, a low murmur beneath the clinking of spoons and Isla's sleepy coos. Outside the window, the sky hung low heavy with something unnamed, something waiting. The clouds weren't dramatic yet, just unsettled, like the pause before a sentence you don't want to finish. "Spring thunderstorm advisory," the broadcaster intoned. "Severe wind gusts, possible hail, isolated tornado risk in Rainford County and surrounding areas." Leah glanced at the radio, her hand frozen mid-stir above a bottle warmer. Marco looked up from the sink, where he was rinsing baby bottles. "Storm season," he shrugged. "They always hype it up." But Koa didn't shrug. He stood motionless by the sliding glass door, ears pricked. His head tilted slightly, as if listening to something beyond the glass, beyond the wind. Something humans weren't built to hear. Leah caught the shift in his posture. "Koa?" she called gently. His ears flicked toward her voice, but he didn't move. She walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder, just behind the scar tissue where fur no longer grew. His muscles were taut beneath her touch like cables pulled tight. She glanced at Marco. "We should probably check the emergency supplies, just in case." He rinsed the last bottle and turned off the tap. "We've got batteries, canned food, water. It's not like we're going to war." Leah didn't argue, but her eyes lingered on Koa. Because while Marco trusted forecasts, Koa trusted instinct. By afternoon, the wind had picked up. Not violent yet, just persistent. Like fingers knocking at the corners of the house, testing for weaknesses. The trees along the fence line swayed uneasily, and the sky had turned the color of pewter, dense and colorless. Leah began walking the house with a clipboard, something she used to do before Isla was born, back when organizing soothed her nerves. Now it was survival wrapped in routine. Basement door unlocked? Check. Flashlights tested? Check. Extra formula packed in a sealed bag? Check. Diapers, matches, first aid kit, all tucked in a bin labeled storm box beneath the stairs. Marco watched her from the hallway, arms crossed. "You know the power might not even go out." She looked up from sealing a Ziploc bag of baby wipes. "And if it does?" He sighed. "You've always prepared for the worst. I admire it. I just don't want us living like fear is the default." "This isn't fear," she said calmly. "It's parenting." And then, as if summoned by the weight of her words, a sharp thud sounded from upstairs, followed by Koa's growl. It wasn't loud. It was low, guttural, and controlled. Not panic warning. Leah bolted up, heart racing, already halfway to Isla's room when she realized Koa hadn't followed. He remained planted at the bottom of the stairs, unmoving. "Koa?" she called. Stillness. And then he began to pace, back and forth. Living room rug to hallway and back again. His steps were measured, but frantic. His head jerked slightly, as if trying to place a sound no one else could hear. It wasn't just the wind. It was something deeper. Something wrong. Marco, sensing the shift, walked over. "You think he's picking up on the pressure drop?" "I don't know," Leah whispered, eyes darting to Isla's monitor on the counter. "But I've never seen him like this. Not even during fireworks." Koa paused mid-step and let out a breathless huff, then turned sharply toward the fireplace. His nails clicked against the hardwood as he began pacing again, more agitated this time. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He warned. Leah moved to crouch beside him. "What is it, buddy? What are you trying to tell us?" He stopped, pressed his nose briefly to her palm, then turned his head toward the ceiling and let out a slow exhale through his nose, almost like frustration. The weather alert tone shrieked from Leah's phone. She grabbed it instinctively. "Tornado watch issued for Rainford County. Expect heavy winds, hail. Shelter advised within 2 hours." Marco stood still, finally blinking the disbelief from his eyes. "You still think it's hype?" she asked, voice flat. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the basement door and flipped the light switch. The bulb flickered, then buzzed to life. "I'll double-check the backup batteries," he said quietly. Outside, the wind turned a corner. It wasn't playful anymore. It sounded like intention, like something had chosen this house, this family. And Koa? He stood again at the glass door, face lifted toward the trees, bending under the sky's weight. His tail was still, his breath steady. He couldn't see the storm coming, but he felt it. And long before thunder split the horizon, Koa had already chosen his position, not in fear, but in readiness. The sky turned the color of bruised metal. It was late afternoon, but inside the house, it already felt like dusk. Shadows pooled in corners, and the wind outside began to whistle with a voice sharp enough to slip through seams in the windows. Isla had just fallen asleep finally, and Leah was downstairs organizing supplies when she heard it. Scratch. A single scrape at first, like something brushing against wood. Then another. Then the unmistakable clack of claws. She froze. It wasn't coming from the front door, not the hallway. It was upstairs. Again. By the time Leah climbed the staircase, her gut already knew. Koa was in the master bedroom. And he wasn't just standing, he was digging. His massive body was pressed tightly against the wall opposite the bed, one paw clawing at the drywall in short, frantic bursts. His nose hovered just inches from the surface, head jerking back every few seconds like he was trying to recoil from something no one else could see. "Koa!" Leah gasped, stepping forward. "No, no, not again!" He didn't stop. His ears were pinned, his breathing came hard. With each scratch, flecks of white dust lifted from the wall, coating his snout and paws. Marco was right behind her. "Jesus, he's doing it again. He hasn't touched a wall since the nursery," Leah whispered, watching the dog tear into the plaster like it was trying to get out, or trying to let something out. Marco approached him, hands raised. "Koa! Hey, stop! You're okay." But Koa didn't flinch. His paw struck again, and this time it left a bloody streak. "Okay, that's enough," Marco barked, stepping forward. Leah caught his arm. "Wait." The air in the room had shifted. It wasn't just the tension of seeing Koa in distress. It was the feeling that something else was here, lurking just beneath the surface of their drywall. A subtle vibration, almost imperceptible. Then from deep inside the wall, bzzz. It was faint, barely there, but it was real. The three of them froze. Marco, Leah, and the blind dog who had once been called Broken. Marco leaned in closer, pressed his ear to the wall. And there it was again, buzzing. Not like a faulty light fixture, not like wiring, organic, living. "No," Marco muttered, backing up. "It can't be again. It's not possible." Leah's heart dropped to her stomach. "Bees." Marco turned to her. "How the hell could it happen twice?" Leah's voice cracked. "I don't know. But Koa knew." They called the fire department. Again. And while they waited, Marco wrapped Koa's paw in a dish towel, his hand surprisingly gentle despite the frustration in his voice. "You can't keep doing this to yourself," he murmured, not sure if the words were for the dog or for him. Koa didn't growl, didn't flinch. He just leaned ever so slightly into Marco's thigh, not for comfort, for confirmation, because he had warned them again. When the fire captain arrived, same one from the nursery incident, he blinked at the address, then said, "Didn't I just see you folks a few weeks ago?" They led him upstairs. He ran a scope along the wall, listened, tapped, waited, his brow furrowed. "I don't believe this," he said finally. Another hive. Massive, too, deep in the insulation. And judging by the vibration, these aren't the calm kind. Marco exhaled hard. "Are they Africanized?" The captain nodded grimly. "I won't say for sure until we test, but if they are, your dog may have just saved you twice." Leah stared at Koa, who now lay quietly on the floor, his head resting on his unbandaged paw, eyes closed, not in rest, but in relief. He had been heard. Later that evening, as the first drops of rain tapped against the windows and the wind rose in pitch, Marco sat beside Leah on the floor of the nursery. Isla slept in her crib. The monitor blinked softly beside them. And downstairs, Koa rested, exhausted but vigilant. Leah broke the silence. "He's not broken, Marco. He's something else." Marco didn't respond right away. Then he reached down and pulled a small white fleck from his jeans, drywall. He stared at it for a long moment. "I think," he finally said, "he sees more than any of us ever could." The wind had begun to speak in a different tone. It wasn't just howling now, it roared like some unseen beast pressing its weight against the bones of the house. The kind of sound that made you instinctively gather your child closer, the kind that told you nature was no longer just passing through. It was choosing where to land. Marco stood in the hallway with the crowbar in hand, jaw set, his eyes flicking from the stairs to the bedroom door where the buzzing behind the wall had turned angrier, harsher. "I'm going to crack the wall open," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Just enough for them to breathe. If we wait for the team to come back tomorrow—" Leah shook her head from the nursery door. "We can't risk it. They said they'd neutralize it in the morning, not now. But we have a baby here, Marco, if they swarm." "I know," he said, not unkindly. He looked at Isla through the half-open door, small and asleep, her fingers curled like a shell. Koa stood at the top of the stairs. He hadn't moved for 15 minutes, just faced the wall, silent now, head low. The storm outside mirrored something in him, something old. His body was tense, rigid, waiting. Marco raised the crowbar, and the sky split open. Crack! The flash came before the sound. A burst of white light so violent it lit up the entire upstairs hallway, like daylight. Leah screamed. The air snapped, charged and dry. Then came the sound, boom, and then the ceiling fell. It wasn't just a branch, It was half an oak. The tree tore through the roof like paper, smashing into the far end of the hall, splintering the rafters, exploding drywall into dust. A picture frame shattered, glass scattered across the floor like fallen stars. The power died in a blink, plunging the entire house into darkness, save for the throbbing pulse of lightning still cracking in the distance. Leah's scream cut the dark. "Ashla!" Marco turned, sprinting. The baby monitor gave a final blink and went silent. And from upstairs, a new sound. Buzzing, louder, angrier. The wall next to Koa vibrated, then cracked. Bees, not dozens, hundreds. They poured out in swirls cascading from behind the broken drywall like liquid shadow, angry, disoriented, drawn to the storm light and the scent of human breath. Marco froze in his tracks as the cloud erupted across the hallway, veering sharply toward the nursery. And then Koa moved. Not away, forward. He charged through the cloud, didn't hesitate, didn't snarl. He barreled past Marco straight into the thickest part of the swarm and took the sting's face, back, muzzle. He slammed his body into the broken wall like a shield, blocking the widening gap, snarling now, not at the bees, but at the danger he couldn't see, but somehow knew had to be stopped. Stingers landed like pinpricks across his fur. Blood bloomed under his coat. He didn't flinch, just held the line. Marco got to the nursery. Leah had scooped Isla into her arms, holding a pillow over the baby's face as she crouched beneath the crib. Her arms were trembling. "They're coming," she whispered, eyes wide with disbelief. "Marco, they're in the hallway." "No," he said. "Koa is." Down the hall, Koa still stood spine-arched, one paw braced against the torn wood, body trembling now, but unmoving. His ears twitched. His eyes, though clouded and sightless, focused on the air in front of him, like he could see something the world couldn't. A bee crawled from his nose. He didn't shake it off. Another sting landed near his eye. Still, he stood. Marco moved behind him, crouched low. "Hey, buddy," he said, voice cracking. "You don't have to do this alone." He took off his flannel, covered his own head, and shielded Koa's side with his arm, swinging blindly at the bees. Together, man and dog formed a barrier in the dark. And in that moment, Marco stopped being afraid. Leah called down to them, "The basement! We need to move now!" "Go!" Marco yelled back. "Koa won't—" Her voice broke. "He won't leave the wall!" Marco turned to the dog, voice close to a whisper now. "Come on. She's safe now, she's safe." Koa's body sagged only slightly, but enough. One paw moved, then another. Marco took the lead, guiding him by touch, and Koa, bloody, swollen, stung but still standing, followed. They reached the top of the basement steps, just as another wind gust howled through the broken roof. Leah held Isla tight to her chest. Her eyes met Marco's, and then dropped to the dog beside him. Her lip quivered. "Oh, my God!" Koa's legs were shaking. His muzzle dripped with blood and venom, but his tail moved once, just once, as if to say, "I did it." Then he collapsed. The wind outside was no longer a sound. It was a pressure, pressing in from all sides, as though the house itself was beginning to groan beneath its weight. Downstairs, in the narrow staircase leading into the Bennetts' unfinished basement, each creak of the old wooden steps felt like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Leah clutched Isla to her chest, wrapped in a blanket and her own trembling arms. Marco followed close behind, one arm steadying Koa, who stumbled every few feet, his breaths shallow, but his movements purposeful. He wasn't walking to hide. He was leading. Behind them, the upstairs was a battlefield. Wind raged through the hole in the roof. Rain now poured in, soaking what the bees hadn't already ruined. The floor was littered with shattered picture frames, buzzing remnants, and the dark scent of wet timber and smoke. But none of that followed them down here. Not yet. The light bulb at the top of the stairwell flickered, then went out completely. Darkness fell. Only the distant rumble of thunder gave any shape to the world, and Koa, bloodied and stung, kept moving. He didn't stop at the bottom of the stairs, didn't circle the storage shelves or rest in the familiar corner where Marco once kept tools. Instead, he veered left, toward a part of the basement Leah had barely looked at since they moved in, a wall of exposed stone, crumbling mortar. And in the corner, a door, rusted, narrow, sealed shut by time and forgetfulness. Marco stared. "I didn't even know we had a door there." Leah shook her head. "We don't. At least I thought we didn't." But Koa did. He reached the threshold, nose pressed to the seams, let out a low, throaty sound, half growl, half plea. His paw scratched once at the base, then he staggered back. Leah stepped forward, adjusting Isla's weight on her hip. "What is this place?" Marco crouched beside the handle. The metal was cold and rough, flaking in his grip. He gave it a tug. Nothing. He leaned in with more force, putting his shoulder into it. Clang! The door gave way with a groan, the hinges screaming in protest. And behind it, darkness, but a different kind. Not damp, not moldy, still, like air that hadn't moved in decades. Marco reached in and fumbled for a switch. His fingers met a plastic panel older than anything else in the house, and when he flipped it, a single low light blinked on overhead. The glow was weak, yellowed, but enough to reveal everything. It wasn't a crawl space. It was a room, 12 by 12 feet, concrete walls lined with faded metal shelving, an old cot in the corner, stacks of sealed boxes, a dust-covered water pump, and on the back wall, barely legible through rust, a stamp, U.S. Civil Defense, Cold War issue. "It's a bomb shelter," Marco whispered. "From the 60s, maybe earlier." Leah stepped inside, stunned. "Is it safe?" Marco turned slowly, scanning. "Ventilation units intact. The seal on that door, it was airtight. Look at the intake ducts. It's got a filtration system." He walked toward the far wall, brushed dust off a laminated sheet. "VX, sarin, smoke, bee venom." He blinked. "Leah, this system can filter airborne toxins. This isn't just a bunker. It's designed for biological events." He turned, and for the first time, he understood. Koa hadn't been running. He hadn't been hiding. He had chosen this room. Not because it was quiet, not because it was cool, but because it was the only place the baby would survive. Leah sat down slowly on the cot, Isla still asleep against her chest. Her eyes welled. Her voice was barely a whisper. "He knew." Marco crouched beside Koa, who was now lying across the threshold, half in, half out of the shelter. His paws were raw, his muzzle swollen, but his chest still rose and fell. And his ears flicked toward the baby, still listening. Marco reached out, placed a hand gently on his side. "You brought us here," he murmured, "not out of instinct, not out of fear." Koa didn't move, but his tail thumped once, and that was enough. The storm screamed above. The hive had burst. The house would never be the same. But below, in the forgotten belly of a home they'd barely begun to understand. A blind dog had chosen the only room in which his family would live, and now, finally, he let himself rest. The light from the ancient ceiling bulb buzzed softly, casting a honey-hued glow across the dust-laden air, like mist frozen in place. Silence pressed down on the concrete walls of the room, thick, sacred. It was the kind of silence that felt earned, not given. The kind that came after the screaming, after the storm. Koa lay just inside the shelter's threshold, his body blocking the door as if he were still guarding something. His chest rose slowly, tremulously, like each breath cost him something. The coarse pads of his front paws were torn open, streaked with blood and grime. His muzzle was swollen from multiple stings, black fur puffed and distorted. But even now, his ears twitched toward Isla's soft, sleeping breaths. He had led them into salvation on broken legs, and now the weight was no longer his to carry. Marco dropped to his knees beside him. "Koa, hey. Easy. Easy, boy." He reached out gently, brushing blood from the fur around Koa's nose. Koa didn't flinch, didn't snarl or move. He simply let Marco touch him, as if this too was part of the mission. Behind them, Leah sat on the edge of the cot, cradling Isla tighter. Her hair was damp with storm sweat. Her eyes shone in the low light, but not from fear, from awe. "Marco," she whispered. "He knew. He knew." Marco nodded once, slowly. "This place, this whole room, I didn't even know it existed. But he did. Somehow." He stood, wiping his palms against his jeans, and moved to the shelves along the back wall. Rows of dusty metal cans lined the storage rack, labels faded but intact. Water purification tablets, emergency rations, respirator filters, a dented army green box marked Medical 1962. He opened one and found rolls of gauze, antibiotic ointment, and even vet-style bandage wrap. He turned back to Leah. "This isn't just a bunker. It's a time capsule. Whoever built it wasn't paranoid. They were prepared." He dropped to a crouch again, beginning to gently wrap Koa's paws. With each touch, Koa winced, but never pulled away. Leah's voice cracked, barely audible above the groaning timbers overhead. "I used to think he was broken." Marco looked up, meeting her eyes. "So did I." She stroked Isla's head, her voice softer now. "But maybe he's just been through more than anyone ever asked him to survive." The words lingered, suspended in the stale air. Then the baby stirred, letting out a half-whimper. Koa's ears flicked. His head didn't rise, his legs didn't shift, but his body tensed ever so slightly, still ready. Still hers. Leah saw it and smiled through a tear. Even now, he's still on duty. Marco finished bandaging the last paw, using strips of the old gauze layered with ointment. He brushed a hand down Koa's side, pausing over the scar tissue he hadn't noticed before. Ridges along the ribs, the kind that came not from birth, but from fire. "He's done this before," Marco murmured. "Saved someone like this before." The room felt heavier with the truth, not because it was tragic, because it was true. As the wind raged outside and thunder rumbled like distant artillery, Leah reached for one of the blankets folded in the corner. She laid it over Koa's body, tucking it around him with slow, reverent hands. "Rest now," she whispered. But her voice trembled not just from emotion, from realization. They had nearly ignored him. They had nearly dismissed the very soul who had saved their daughter not once, but twice. Not with bark or bite, but with presence, with instinct, with pain, if that's what it took. She watched his breathing slow beneath the blanket. His tail twitched once. And that's when she understood something she hadn't before, not in the shelter. Not even when she'd torn down the wallpaper with her bare hands. Koa didn't just see with his heart. He carried the memory of fire inside him. And still, he chose to trust again. Later, after Isla had fallen into deeper sleep and the wind had softened to a distant hiss, Marco sat on the cot beside Leah. They didn't speak much. There was nothing to say that wasn't already spoken by the silence around them. Occasionally, the emergency light would flicker. But it held. Like the room itself, it was old but not broken. Like the dog lying at its door. A protector. A survivor. A guide. Leah reached over and placed a hand on Marco's knee. "When this is over," she said softly, "I want to rebuild the nursery wall. Not just patch it. Rebuild it, right? Bee-proof. Soundproof. Safe." Marco nodded. "We will." She looked down at Koa. "But this time, I want his bed there too." Marco smiled faintly. "I think he's already claimed it." Above them, the storm would pass. The house would scar and shift and remember. But down here, in the forgotten room sealed for decades, a family had been rebuilt. One breath, one heartbeat, one blind dog at a time. Marco sat at the steel table under the bunker's dim emergency light. A yellowed instruction manual cracked open in front of him like a relic, unearthed from a different war. Dust flaked from the corners of the pages. The font was small, machine-typed, and the paper had the brittle texture of something meant to outlast people. Leah rocked Isla gently in her arms, bundled tight in her hospital blanket. The baby had stopped crying hours ago, calmed by the steady rhythms of the room below and the not-so-distant presence of Koa still curled near the sealed door, tail barely moving, ears twitching only when Isla stirred. Marco flipped to the next section of the manual and stilled. "Leah," he said quietly, "you need to hear this." She looked up, tired, her eyes rimmed with concern, but alert. Marco cleared his throat, then read aloud. Unit 4C. Filter. Designed for sustained isolation during chemical threat or environmental toxin exposure. Capable of neutralizing airborne particulate venom, including apitoxins from large-scale insect activity or hybrid bee aggression. Leah stared. "Wait, venom? You mean like bee stings?" Marco nodded. "More than that. It's not just the stings. When disturbed in high numbers, certain species like Africanized bees release apitoxins into the air. Microparticles. If enough bees are active in an enclosed space, and especially if there's electric shock or vibration," he paused. "The air becomes toxic," he finished. Leah looked down at Isla. "Oh my God." Marco's hand trembled slightly as he turned the page. "This place was built for nuclear fallout, but it's the filters. They're what saved us tonight, what saved her." There was a long silence. Then Leah whispered, "Koa knew." Marco didn't respond right away. He glanced over at the dog still breathing slow, still refusing to fully rest. "He led us down here before we even realized the threat," Marco said finally, "before the hive was even awake." He shut the manual slowly, reverently. "I thought it was instinct. I thought it was some lingering canine programming. But no, this wasn't training." He looked at Leah again. This was a choice. Leah moved closer, placing Isla carefully in the bassinet they'd found tucked behind a crate marked Medical 1965. The sheets were stiff but clean, sealed. Isla's tiny body shifted only once before settling into sleep. "She wouldn't have survived up there," Leah whispered. "Not with the power out. Not with the ventilation system pulling the toxins through every vent. We wouldn't have even known what was happening until it was too late." Marco exhaled slowly. "I was so sure he was just reacting, reliving something, panicking. But he wasn't." He rubbed the bridge of his nose. He was calculating, listening, guiding. Leah turned to him, voice full of something deeper than awe-belief. "Do you remember what Camille said in that voicemail?" she asked. "Koa doesn't protect the strongest. He protects the smallest." Marco nodded, emotion rising in his throat. Leah walked to Koa, knelt beside him, and gently stroked the fur along his neck. His head barely lifted, but his cloudy eyes turned toward her as if registering the warmth of her voice. "You knew this was the only place she'd survive," she whispered. "Didn't you?" A soft whine escaped Koa's throat, low, brief, but undeniable. "Yes," Marco said behind her. "He did." That night, as the wind howled and the walls upstairs bore the weight of fallen limbs and splintered beams, a kind of quiet honor filled the shelter. Koa, blind and battered, had done what no human in that house could have done. He had recognized the air was dangerous. He had known the baby's lungs were fragile. And he had found the one room left on Earth with filtered breath. Later, Marco opened a notebook tucked in the corner of the shelter meant for logging air quality and maintenance dates. Instead, he wrote something else. Date, April 17th. Entry: Today, a blind dog saved our daughter from a storm, a hive, and the invisible enemy we couldn't smell, see, or hear. His name is Koa. He is not a pet. He is not a remnant. He is the reason we are still a family. Outside, the storm slowly wandered east. Inside, beneath the weight of a world that had nearly broken them, a blind German shepherd, once cast aside, slept at the threshold of safety. Still listening, still watching without sight, still saving those too small to save themselves. The storm had passed, but not everything that arrived with it had left. It was 2 days after the collapse. The roof was still tarped in blue plastic, buzzing faintly under wind. Inside, the Bennetts moved carefully through their home, half lit, half salvaged. A quiet reverence lingered in every room, as if they were walking through the remains of a near loss too vast to name. Koa lay by the hearth, swaddled in blankets Leah had stitched from Isla's unused crib sheets. His face was still swollen from the stings, paws bandaged, breaths shallow, but even. Isla gurgled softly in her bassinet near the couch, watched over with the devotion of 3 hearts instead of 2. And that was when the knock came. A firm, 3-beat rhythm unfamiliar. Marco opened the door cautiously, expecting insurance adjusters or repair crews. But what stood on the porch was neither clipboard nor badge. It was Camille Thorne. She hadn't changed much since the shelter video call, a presence both composed and aching. Wind tousled strands of gray-streaked hair around her temples. Her eyes darted instantly past Marco's shoulder. "To be honest," she said quietly, "I didn't plan this. I just couldn't not come." Marco stepped aside. Leah, standing with Isla in her arms, froze when she saw the woman. Their eyes met, and Leah instinctively tightened her hold on the baby. "I'm sorry to show up like this," Camille added, voice breaking. "But I need to see him. Just once, please." Leah hesitated, then slowly nodded. Camille crossed the threshold like a soldier returning to the ruins of a battlefield. And when she saw Koa still resting by the fireplace, head lifting just barely at the sound of her voice, she let out a sound that was half gasp, half prayer. "Koa," she whispered, kneeling. His ears twitched. His nose lifted toward her like a compass, still finding true north. Leah watched from the side. Marco stayed near the hallway, arms folded, but his stance wasn't defensive. It was conflicted. Camille stroked the fur between Koa's ears, her voice shaking. "You found them, didn't you? Just like he said you would." She turned to Leah. "Jackson always said Koa wasn't meant for one handler, that he had more to give than any of us understood. But after the fire, after I lost Jackson, I wasn't strong enough to be around him." Leah's voice was soft. "We read the will clause, the voicemail. He wanted Koa to find a child who needed him." Camille smiled bitterly. "And he did. Again." There was a pause. Then she looked directly at Leah. "But now I wonder if maybe I made a mistake letting him go. Maybe he belongs with me again. I have a grandson now, just turned 3. And I thought, after everything he's done, maybe it's time he came home." The room went still. Koa didn't move. Isla stirred in Leah's arms. Marco stepped forward slightly, tension tightening his shoulders. Leah drew a slow breath. "I don't think he wants to leave." Camille's eyes welled. "I'm not asking as someone trying to undo what's been done. I'm asking as someone who let go of the last piece of her husband before she was ready." Koa's nose nudged forward, but not toward Camille, toward Leah. Blind as he was, he found her foot, rested his chin gently against it, as if to say, "This is where I stand now." "I don't want to take away what you've built," Camille said after a long silence, "and I won't force it, but maybe we could visit sometimes, so he knows he didn't have to lose all of us to find something new." Leah nodded slowly. That would be okay." Marco added, voice low but sure, "You're part of his story. Just like Jackson. Just like the fire. But that story isn't over. It's just changed chapters." Camille looked at the dog again. "He chose you, like he chose Jackson once." She stood, brushing a hand gently down Koa's side. "I thought I came here to reclaim him, but I think maybe he was never mine to begin with. Not really." Outside, the wind had softened. The bees were gone, the plaster patched, but the house would forever carry the mark of where the lightning struck, and who stood in its path. That night, as Camille drove away, she left behind not a claim, but a blessing, and Koa, still bruised, still bandage-shifted, just enough to rest his muzzle against Isla's bassinet, because even heroes with broken bodies remember where the next life begins. The scent of wet plaster still clung to the hallway like a ghost that refused to leave. 2 days after Camille's visit, the Bennets had started repairs, if only to feel like they were moving forward. But something lingered behind the walls, beyond the trauma of bees and storm winds. It tugged at Marco in particular, a gnawing uncertainty he couldn't name, but couldn't ignore either. It began with Koa again, even bandaged and slow, He still paced the corridor outside the nursery, not in panic, not in distress, but with a silent urgency, as if something else still hummed behind the paint. Marco watched him one night, flashlight in hand, crouched beside him as Koa's nose hovered at a narrow seam in the drywall. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl. He just pressed his head gently, deliberately against the baseboard. Marco didn't sleep that night. By morning, he had made the call. The inspector arrived just after lunch. A stocky man named Roy, with 30 years of pest control and structural safety under his belt. He carried thermal sensors, humidity meters, and a demeanor that said, "I've seen everything," until he stepped into the hallway and Koa limped toward the wall. "That the blind dog you mentioned?" Roy asked. Marco nodded. Roy raised an eyebrow. "Let's see what he's trying to tell us." They began with the wall Koa had fixated on during the storm behind Isla's crib, where the hive had once lived. Marco expected to find leftover debris, maybe traces of wax or wings. But when they peeled back the new plasterboard and insulation, what they found chilled the room. Not just honeycomb residue, not just dried venom sacs, wires, dozens of them, twisted, tangled, frayed, amateurishly rerouted through wall studs, exposed copper, brittle shielding, some of them blackened at the tips. "Jesus," Roy muttered, running a gloved hand along one melted section. "This isn't just shoddy. This is a lit match waiting for the gasoline." Marco swallowed hard. Roy tapped a few with his tester. The sensor blinked red. "Live current. And look here, these scorched marks? That's heat concentration. Hot spots, you wouldn't hear it, you wouldn't smell it, not yet. But a few more humid days, one lightning strike hitting the grid again, it would have gone up like tinder." Marco leaned in, his hands bracing the frame, the wall that had once held his daughter's crib, the wall Koa had bled against. He saw it now, not just as damage, but as a pattern, a haunting thread running through the dog's life. A burning orphanage, a blind animal clawing at drywall, a child placed unknowingly in the same line of fire. Roy glanced over. "Dog was trying to tell you something, huh?" Marco nodded slowly. "He always is." They continued deeper. Another section behind the master bedroom, another hive site. More wiring this time, half melted through the insulation, dangerously close to the attic beam. "Someone did some real cowboy rewiring here," Roy said. "Probably before you even bought the place. Maybe tried to split a circuit illegally, but it's degrading. Fast." Marco exhaled through clenched teeth. So the bees weren't just a threat. They were a trigger. Roy paused. "How do you mean?" Marco stood. He didn't just smell the bees. He felt what came next. He knew what this place was becoming before we did, before the fire even had a chance. Back inside, Koa had returned to Isla's room. He didn't pace anymore. He simply rested, as if his job was done again. Marco crouched beside him, gently brushing the fur behind his ears. "You saw it coming, didn't you?" The dog didn't react. But Marco didn't need him to. He finally understood. That night, Marco didn't just call an electrician. He called a structural safety team. And while Leah bathed Isla and the wind returned with its usual hum, Marco stood in the hallway, fingers brushing the raw beams. He whispered to no one, and to Koa both, "You didn't just save her. You saved all of us." Again. The old voicemail had been played a dozen times that week. And yet, as Camille sat at the edge of the Bennett's kitchen table, cradling Leah's phone in both trembling hands, it still undid her. not just the voice, but the pauses between the words, the parts that never changed, even when the world had. "If anything happens to me," her late husband's voice filled the quiet room like a memory made flesh. "Don't send Koa to a kennel. He's not just a dog, Cam. He's got a mission left, a heart that won't let him stop." Outside, the wind had calmed. The repairs on the roof were just beginning. Inside, the house felt like it was breathing again. Walls stripped bare, raw wood exposed, but safe, honest. And in the nursery down the hall, Koa slept on the floor, his body curled toward the crib. Even blind, even bruised, he'd refused to rest until Isla had fallen asleep. Camille wiped her eyes. She knew what this was. Leah poured 2 cups of tea, slid one across the table, then sat down across from her. "He doesn't move until she's asleep. Hasn't since the night of the storm." Camille smiled faintly. "He used to do that with the orphans, too. Wouldn't eat until every kid was accounted for." Leah glanced toward the hallway. "It's like he knows she's more fragile. Somehow." Camille's eyes shone, but not from grief this time. "He does. He always knew which ones had something broken on the inside." They sat in silence for a moment. 2 women bound not by blood, but by shared love, for the same dog, the same kind of loyalty, the same loss. Then Camille reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out an old, folded photo creased, faded but still clear. It showed Koa, younger, sitting beside a man in uniform, Jackson's arm draped around him, the orphanage gate behind them, both of them smiling. "I used to think Koa stayed alive after the fire for me," Camille said softly. "That maybe, somehow, I was still his anchor." Leah didn't interrupt. Camille looked down at the photo again. "But I was wrong. Jackson knew. He said it in that message. He knew Koa would keep going until he found his next child." A soft sound broke the moment. Tiny feet in footy pajamas. Isla had toddled into the hallway, a pacifier still in her mouth, dragging her blanket behind her. Camille turned, instinctively reaching out, and Isla, without hesitation, walked right into her lap. She nestled into Camille's chest, her little fingers curling near the pendant on Camille's necklace. The woman froze, overwhelmed by the warmth of the child's weight, then slowly wrapped her arms around her. A second heartbeat, small, steady, and from the other end of the hallway, Koa lifted his head. No bark, no movement, just a quiet wag of his tail, like a nod, like permission. Camille pressed her lips to the child's hair, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You were the one." That night she packed quietly, refused their offer to stay another day, left the photo on the mantel next to a candle and a note that simply read, "Thank you for giving him purpose." And when Koa limped beside her car, as if to follow, she knelt down, ran her hands through the thick fur on his scruffed neck. "You did it," she whispered. "He'd be proud." "I am." She kissed his forehead once. He didn't flinch, didn't lean in, but he stayed until she opened the door, started the engine, and pulled out of the drive. Only then did he turn back toward the porch, where Isla stood watching, small hand raised in a wave. The storm had passed, but its breath still lingered in the splintered fence posts, the crushed gutters, the yawning hole in the roof that now framed the sky like an unfinished painting. Sunlight streamed through it that morning, sharp and golden, cutting across the fractured beams and dangling insulation like grace finding its way through wreckage. The Bennett's house stood, but only just. And yet there was life inside it. The hum of a kettle, the rustle of nails in a bucket, the quiet thump of a dog's tail against hardwood. Koa lay beside Isla's crib, wrapped in fresh gauze and quiet dignity. His left paw was still swollen, and small red welts dotted his muzzle from the stings. But he hadn't once tried to lick them, hadn't barked or limped for pity. He simply lay there, listening, always listening. And when Isla stirred, he nudged closer. No longer the guardian outside the door. Now the watchman within. Marco stood on the porch, hammer in one hand, eyes scanning the neighborhood. The scent of wet pine and cracked shingles filled the air. Across the street, Mr. Donnelly, retired electrician, part-time philosopher, waved a friendly hand and began hauling scrap boards from his shed. "Don't you dare touch that roof alone," he called. Marco smiled faintly. "I wasn't planning to." From the side yard, the sound of hammering joined the birdsong neighbors patching broken panels, kids picking up strewn toys from the lawn like tiny soldiers after battle. No sirens, no panic, only the quiet solidarity of people who knew loss and chose action anyway. In the kitchen, Leah placed 2 slices of toast onto a chipped plate and exhaled slowly. Her body was sore. Her back ached. The pregnancy weight hadn't vanished yet, and neither had the exhaustion. But something else had shifted, a clarity, a knowing. She had seen what instinct looked like, raw, untrained, real. It didn't always bark or growl or stand tall. Sometimes it crawled through bees and fire to stay beside a crib, and she couldn't go back to normal after witnessing that. That afternoon, Leah drove down to the shelter, the same one where she'd first seen the dog no one else wanted. It looked smaller now, less intimidating. The do not approach signs were still up. The metal kennels still echoed with the same sharp yelps and sharp smells. But this time, Leah walked in like she belonged. "Back again?" asked Marnie, the receptionist, peering up from her clipboard. "I want to volunteer," Leah said simply. Marnie blinked. "With a newborn at home?" "With a dog like Koa at home," she corrected gently. "I've got more to give now." By evening, the house smelled of wood dust and soup. Marco had installed a tarp over the gash in the roof. A neighbor dropped off extension cords for backup power. The news anchor on the battery-powered radio declared the storm the most unpredictable spring front in over 2 decades. Isla gurgled in her bouncer, wrapped in a knitted yellow blanket one of the neighbor girls had left with a note, "For the baby and the brave dog." Koa limped into the room, ears twitching at the sound of her coo, and something in Marco shifted. He'd always seen dogs as working animals measured in performance, obedience, cost. But now, as he knelt beside Koa and gently adjusted the bandage on his paw, Marco felt something else. Reverence. He didn't speak, just pressed his forehead gently to Koa's silent thanks, from a man who finally understood what it meant to be protected without asking. Later that night, Leah slipped a hand beneath the crib and pulled out a small notebook. She began writing. Day 1 after the storm. House, standing. Us, more than standing. Maybe something closer to rooted. Koa, wounded but alert. Watching Isla breathe like it's sacred. And maybe it is. She paused, pen tapping lightly, then added, "Started volunteering at the shelter today. Saw another one, a black shepherd with clouded eyes. They called him Damaged." Funny how wrong they can be. Wonder how many more are out there. waiting to be seen. The moon rose slowly that night, framed by a rectangle of missing ceiling, a hole that let in stars, and beneath them, in a nursery lit by quiet courage, lay a blind dog and a sleeping child, both survivors. The vet clinic was quiet that afternoon. Rain tapped gently against the windows, a far cry from the violence of the recent storm. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, mingling with faint traces of fir and eucalyptus. Marco sat on the vinyl bench, one arm draped protectively around Koa, whose head rested heavily on his thigh. The dog's breath came slow and even, but his body still bore the sign's paw pads raw beneath gauze, one ear nicked and scabbed, his fur thinner around the stung areas. Leah paced gently with Isla in her carrier, bouncing softly with each step, more to soothe herself than the child. Dr. Willis entered the exam room with a clipboard and a tired smile. The man looked like he hadn't slept much, but then again, he'd been Koa's vet since the rescue after the orphanage fire. The look he gave Koa now wasn't just professional, it was personal. "He's been through hell," Dr. Willis said, kneeling in front of the shepherd. "But he's still here. That says something." Marco nodded. "We thought we'd lost him. Twice." Willis exhaled, fingers gently checking Koa's legs. "That's the thing with dogs like him, with trauma like his, some collapse. Koa—" He paused. "Koa recalibrated." Leah stopped pacing. "What do you mean?" Dr. Willis looked up. "I mean that when he lost his sight, and his handler, and everything that gave his life structure, he didn't shut down. He rewired himself, retrained his instincts. You didn't just adopt a blind dog, you adopted a soldier who rebuilt his own mission." He stood and set the clipboard down. "But he needs help now. Real help. Because this kind of bravery, it comes with a cost." Willis rolled out a drawer from the exam table and lifted a small pair of booties, rubber-soled, soft-lined, stitched with what looked like memory foam. "Therapy booties," he explained, "for scarred pads. Give the paws a break from constant pressure. He won't like them at first." Marco raised an eyebrow. "He barely lets me touch his feet." "You'll earn that trust," Willis said simply. "He's already chosen you. It's your job to keep proving he was right." Leah moved closer, Isla sleeping soundly against her chest. "Is he in pain?" "Yes," Willis admitted, adjusting a wrap around Koa's leg. "But not in the way people are. Dogs experience pain differently. They endure it more than they express it, especially dogs who were trained not to whimper." Marco looked down, jaw tight. "So we wouldn't have known." "No," Willis said softly. "You wouldn't. But Koa's been screaming in his own way, through pacing, through those scratches. Through that moment he refused to leave the crib even when the bees stung him." He turned, retrieved a small folder and handed it to Leah. "Inside are care protocols. Rotating cold compresses, paw salve every 12 hours, low-impact movement therapy, no stairs for now, no loud voices, and no forced commands." Leah opened the folder and scanned the pages. Her throat caught when she reached the last one. It was titled, "Post-Trauma Bonding Guidelines for Service Dogs in Civilian Families." It listed suggestions that didn't feel like medicine, but more like grace. "Let him smell your clothes before you enter the room. Narrate your day. Let him hear your rhythms. Leave a worn shirt by the crib when you're gone. Your scent will tell him she's safe." Leah swallowed hard. "You wrote this?" Willis nodded. "For the ones like Koa. The ones who weren't just tools. They were family to someone once. They still need a purpose. The room fell quiet for a moment. Koa lifted his head slowly, blind eyes trained not on a sound, but a presence. He turned toward Isla. Marco watched in silence, then said, almost to himself, "He doesn't need eyes. He just needs to be near her." Willis nodded. "That's how he navigates now, through her scent, her breathing, her heartbeat. You didn't choose him. She did." They left the clinic with a bag of supplies, a new folder of instructions, and something else they hadn't expected. Hope. But not the abstract kind, the kind with Velcro booties and calendared care plans, the kind that required daily work, the kind built not just on survival, but restoration. That night, Marco sat on the living room floor with Koa, trying to slip on the first bootie. Koa resisted, pulling back slightly. "Easy, buddy," Marco whispered. "I know it's weird, but it's so you don't bleed anymore." Koa held still, just long enough for the booty to slide on. Marco let out a breath. "See? Not so bad?" From the hallway, Leah watched Isla, now asleep in her arms, her tiny fist curled around a pacifier. She smiled, heart full in ways she couldn't explain. Somewhere between the therapy booties and the silence, between Marco's slow forgiveness and Koa's instinctive loyalty, something was healing. Not just Koa, all of them. The morning sun filtered through the patched window, soft and golden, casting ribbons of light across the hardwood floor. The living room still carried the faint scent of cedar wood from the old storm shelter door Marco had salvaged and repurposed into a table. Things were far from perfect. The ceiling had temporary beams, drywall scars hadn't been covered yet, but in some strange, beautiful way it felt more like home than it ever had. Koa lay beside the playmat, head on his front paws, his bandaged legs stretched loosely to one side. He was still healing. The sting wounds had begun to scab and the fur on his muzzle had thinned in places from the allergic reaction. But his breath was steady, peaceful. Isla, now 4 months old, wiggled on her belly, trying to reach the crinkly corner of a stuffed blanket. Her little legs kicked like she was swimming in air, her coos rising and falling like a lullaby that belonged only to her. Leah stood nearby, folding baby clothes into a wicker basket, humming quietly. Then it happened. A tiny hand, more curious than steady, reached outward first in the air, then lower, until it brushed something soft. Koa flinched, not from pain, from surprise. Her fingers rested on his muzzle. The moment stretched, fragile as spun glass. And then her face broke open, the kind of smile no one teaches. No camera can capture it right. It wasn't just gums or light in the eyes. It was something deeper, like her soul had recognized something ancient and gentle. She smiled fully, freely at the blind dog before her. Marco, crouched on the stairs adjusting a baby monitor, looked up at the sound of Leah's gasp. "Marco?" she whispered, one hand covering her mouth. He turned just in time to see Isla's hand curl gently into the fur near Koa's nose, her giggle a stuttering melody. Koa didn't move. He didn't pull away. He just let her hold him. Marco froze, the monitor still clutched in his hand. Something in his chest shifted, not like glass breaking, but like a lock finally turning. He hadn't even realized how long he'd held his breath, how many nights he'd clung to guilt like a second skin. He exhaled, long, slow, as if some piece of himself had been forgiven by a baby who didn't know his past, by a dog who never blamed him, and maybe, just maybe, by himself. Later that evening, after Isla had fallen asleep, Marco stood in the doorway watching Koa rest. "He didn't even flinch," he said, his voice soft with disbelief. "She touched his face, his scars, and he just stayed." Leah nodded. "Because she's the only thing in this world he doesn't need to see to recognize." Marco sat beside her on the couch. "Do you think he knows she smiled?" Leah smiled faintly, leaning into him. "I think he felt it." They stayed like that, the three of them. Well, four wrapped in a quiet peace that had been earned, not gifted. The kind of peace born from fire and storms and sting wounds that went deeper than the skin. And somewhere, in the stillness between heartbeats, a bond rooted in unspeakable loss had finally bloomed into something else. Joy. Not loud, not performative, just pure. It started quietly. A small article in the local paper titled, "Blind Dog Saves Infant from Fatal Bee Attack." At first, few noticed it, hidden between classifieds and obituaries. But by morning, it spread on apps, on TV, and finally national news came calling. By the end of the week, strangers sent flowers. The Bennetts, their house still under repair with tarps flapping like makeshift wings, felt overwhelmed as neighbors, reporters, and children with crayon drawings of a big brown dog and a baby arrived at their door. The town needed a hero, and Koa, he was theirs. They held a small ceremony on the green outside the town hall. Nothing grand, a folding stage, plastic chairs, and a student-painted banner. "Thank you, Koa. You protect what matters most." Leah, carrying baby Isla, wiped a tear as she watched children pet Koa gently and whisper thanks. Though blind, Koa stood calmly. His ears pivoted toward voices, as if he mapped the world through sound and heart. That morning, Marco had picked up a custom collar he'd ordered in secret. A veteran named Saul had crafted it by hand. Stitched leather, brass buckle, and pressed letters read, "Heroes see with their hearts." As Marco fastened it, Koa rested his head on his hand, a gesture that lifted the weight Marco had carried, not of fire, bees, or guilt, but of doubt. Doubt that he could protect his family. That collar wasn't just for Koa, it was for him, too. The mayor spoke about courage beyond sight and miracles in unexpected forms. Leah whispered, "Look at them." Marco saw Isla asleep, her hand curled against Leah's heart, and Koa scarred, limping, stood between them. By choice. After the crowd thinned, a boy in a wheelchair offered Koa a tissue-wrapped bundle, a biscuit, a martial arts medal, and a shaky note. "To Koa, you make me brave." Koa didn't eat the biscuit but bumped the boy's hand and sat beside him, as if to say, "You already are." That night, Marco set Koa's collar on the kitchen table, fingers tracing the words. He thought of fire, bees, guilt, and of Jackson, Camille, and what it meant to protect someone when you felt broken. Koa slept by the door, the collar catching moonlight like a medal he'd earned. On courthouse steps, a larger crowd gathered. Cameras, children on shoulders, elderly neighbors, all for a blind dog. Koa stood steady, ears alert. Leah whispered, "He doesn't know this is for him." Marco answered, "He doesn't need to. He already gave everything." The mayor said, "We honor not just a dog, but a protector, a guide, a soul who knew where to go when none of us did." The crowd applauded, but Koa didn't react. Instead, as if drawn by something deeper than sound, Koa turned his head, sniffed the air, and found Isla. Her heartbeat, soft and familiar, guided him. His tail thumped once. For her. Leah saw it and covered her mouth, tears rising. Marco steadied himself on her shoulder. A reporter whispered, "It's like he just answered." Her colleague replied, "He did." Leah stepped forward, no speech prepared. She kissed Koa's head and whispered, "Every heartbeat she has, every breath she'll take, I owe to you." Koa leaned into her, as if he'd waited for those words. As the square emptied, Koa lay beside the car, metal resting like a warrior's badge. From her seat, Isla reached toward him. Koa turned his muzzle to her palm, wagging once more. Across the street, Camille watched from shadows. She didn't need the ceremony. She understood what Koa had done and what it had cost. In her purse, she carried a framed photo of Jackson in uniform, arms around Koa. The caption read, "Until the last heartbeat." From afar, she saw Isla, Marco, and Koa. Even blind, Koa's tail had twitched when Isla reached out. He had always known. Camille remembered Jackson's last message. "If anything happens to me, make sure Koa finds a kid who needs him. That's who he is. A compass. Give him purpose. Let him save someone." He had. Just not with her. Camille didn't cry at the funeral or when they folded the flag. But today, as the applause faded and Koa's medal shone in the sun, a single tear escaped. That night, under quiet porch lights and faint lullabies, Camille approached the Bennett's door unnoticed. She left the photo frame on the mat, a gift of memory and legacy. Inside, Koa stirred, not in alarm, but as if he sensed her. Camille paused, whispered, "You kept your promise, boy." "And so did I." Then she disappeared into the night. They didn't call a construction crew. Marco insisted on rebuilding the house himself, board by board, nail by nail, not just to repair, but to reclaim what had almost been lost. The oak tree that had crushed part of the roof was gone, except for a slice Marco kept. He sanded it smooth, promising, "We'll make Isla's toy box from it, something born from what tried to break us." The house creaked under scaffolding. Sawdust floated in sunbeams. Marco started with Isla's nursery, not because it was most damaged, but because it was where everything had almost ended. Leah, 7 weeks postpartum, planted lavender and rosemary below the window, determined to repel future swarms. Koa lay beneath, his bandaged paw resting on the grass, alert as ever, sensing each hammer's strike, each footstep. Inside, Isla slept in a bassinet near Koa. The baby monitor was unnecessary. Koa heard what no one else could. When she whimpered, his ears twitched. When she stirred, he stood, still blind but never lost. At night, they dined by candlelight. It wasn't that the power was out. They just preferred peace. One evening, Leah asked, "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again?" Marco answered, "No. But maybe this version after is stronger." Leah smiled. "Then let's stay awake." One afternoon, Marco mounted Koa's old medal on a plaque made from that oak wood. Above it he carved, "He didn't see the danger. He sensed it and chose us anyway." Beside it, Koa's retired harness hung, a reminder of sacrifice. Leah posted a simple photo. Koa on the nursery rug, muzzle near baby booties. Caption, "He sees with his heart. She shared it on a blog she quietly started, the Heart Seer Chronicles. She wrote about small things: Koa following Isla's scent, refusing to rest unless he heard her heartbeat. The post went viral. Messages flooded in. Families adopted disabled dogs, calling them heart seers. The shelter thanked Leah. People are lining up for them because of Koa. Koa grew older. His coat grayed, but his ears never stopped listening. In the yard, Isla now, nearly 3 toddled barefoot, giggling. Koa didn't rise. He tracked her by sound, by heart. When she dropped a flower on his paw, he thumped his tail once, just for her. Marco and Leah watched, grateful. "Still watching over her?" Leah said softly. "Always," Marco replied, voice thick with emotion. As dusk fell, Isla climbed onto Koa's back, resting her cheek there. "Night-night, Koa," she whispered. He answered with a soft hum, a lullaby, felt more than heard. Leah knelt beside him, tears pricking her eyes. "You did it. You kept your promise." Koa leaned into her touch, then settled once more. And as fireflies lit the night, he kept his quiet vigil, because that's who he was. Always. The storm came just after midnight. Rain danced like nails across the rooftop, steady and insistent, while wind curled through the eaves in long, drawn-out breaths, like the house itself was holding something it couldn't speak aloud. Every so often, thunder rolled deep beneath the mountains, like an old god turning in his sleep. Leah stirred in bed, not yet fully awake, not yet fully dreaming. A flicker of unease slid down her spine. Then it came. Not the baby monitor, not Isla's cry, but Koa's growl. Low, guttural. The kind of sound that didn't wake you. It unlocked something in your chest. She sat bolt upright. The baby monitor still blinked green. No sound, no movement, but Koa's growl deepened. From somewhere beyond the hallway. From Isla's room. Leah threw back the covers, her breath catching with the kind of fear only a parent could know. The kind that strikes before your brain has words, before your heart has reasons. She ran. The hallway was darker than it should have been. Power flickered once, then cut, leaving only the pale emergency backup light humming from the kitchen outlet. The storm had found the lines again. Another crack of thunder shook the windows. Leah's bare feet slid slightly on the hardwood as she turned the corner into Isla's room. And there, already, there was Koa, standing still, facing the crib. His body like a statue carved in shadow. No barking, no lunging, just that sound, that warning hum, that deep, primal growl that came not from fear, but from knowing. Leah rushed to the crib. Isla was sitting up, barely awake, her cheeks damp with tears, her tiny fists clutching the blanket, as if it had the power to save her. She wasn't screaming, but her mouth was open, silent terror, like something had followed her out of a dream and hadn't let go. Leah scooped her up instantly, murmuring, "It's okay, baby. I'm here. I'm here." But even as she rocked her daughter, her eyes moved back to Koa, and something in her stomach twisted, because Koa wasn't growling at the window, or the door, or the thunder. He was growling at the corner of the room, the far right edge behind the rocking chair where nothing but shadows gathered and wallpaper peeled slightly at the baseboard. Leah swallowed hard. She stepped toward Koa. "Easy, boy. It's just a storm." But she didn't believe it. Not fully. Not after what he'd sensed before. Not after the bees, the fire, the wire. She shifted Isla in her arms and reached for the flashlight by the dresser. The beam flicked on, unsteady in her shaking hand, casting sharp light across the floor, up the walls, and finally, there, near the baseboard, tiny black shapes crawling, scattering from the beam. Termites? Ants? No. Wings. Too many. Leah's blood went cold. She backed up instinctively. "Marco!" she called out. Just once, but her voice didn't carry. Koa took a single step forward, still growling, still guarding. Suddenly, Isla twisted in Leah's arms and let out a soft sob, not a loud cry, but a sound too small for how deep it cut. And that's when the baby monitor lit up. Finally, a delayed beep, as if the electronics were just catching up to what Koa had known minutes earlier. Leah turned, fleeing the nursery with Isla cradled tight, Koa at her heels. Down the hall, Marco met them halfway, flashlight in hand, confusion on his face. "What happened? The storm?" "Something's in there," Leah said breathlessly. "He knew again. Before anything." Koa brushed against Marco's side, pausing only for a second. His coat was damp, his ears twitching, but his growl had faded. Now he was silent, focused. They checked the room again, this time together, and this time they saw it clearly. A new swarm just beginning. At the corner beam buried deeper than the last, and below it, wiring again, burnt, melted. Another fire waiting to happen. Had they not gone in? Had Koa not been there first? Had Leah waited for the monitor? Later that night, as rain softened and Isla finally drifted back to sleep in their bed, Marco sat on the floor beside Koa, with shaking hands. "You knew," he whispered. Koa didn't lift his head, just let Marco's hand rest on his back. "You knew before she cried." Leah knelt beside them, her voice a whisper in the dark. "He doesn't see with his eyes?" Marco nodded slowly. "No, he sees with something more." Outside, thunder rumbled one final time before retreating into the hills. But in the nursery, the corner was empty now. The whisper of wings had vanished, and in their place, silence, guarded, earned, because Koa had stood watch again and heard the whisper before anyone else could. The rain had stopped 2 days ago, but the earth still held on to its memory-soft soil beneath every step, the scent of renewal clinging to the air like the final note of a lullaby. Spring wasn't quite in bloom, but it had begun to hum beneath the surface. And the Bennets' home, still halfway under repair, held a kind of peace that came not from perfection, but from perseverance. Leah sat cross-legged on the porch, Isla in her lap, giggling as she tugged on the brim of her mother's sun hat. Beside them, in his usual spot beneath the pergola, Koa lay like a statue of loyalty and quiet power. The leather collar around his neck, newly oiled and worn just enough, bore the words Marco had engraved weeks earlier. "Heroes see with their hearts." He no longer paced. He no longer needed to. The sound of approaching footsteps stirred the afternoon stillness. A sedan pulled up. Not rushed, not hesitant, just careful. Leah stood, Isla on her hip, as a young couple stepped out, holding hands, their eyes scanning the porch with a mixture of nerves and hope. She already knew who they were. Danielle and Carter. They'd called the shelter last week. They were thinking of adopting Arlo, the deaf Labrador mix, who had been overlooked again and again. The couple had read Leah's blog. They knew about Koa, but they hadn't known they'd be meeting him in person. Leah greeted them with warmth and a quiet smile. No sales pitch, no expectations, just stories. "I used to think dogs with disabilities were broken," Danielle admitted, her voice small but honest. "That maybe they'd need more than we could give." Leah nodded slowly, then glanced down at Isla now, nestled against her chest, half asleep, and then at Koa. "He didn't need more," she said gently. "He just needed someone to see what he already was." They sat on the porch for nearly an hour. Leah spoke softly. Marco joined halfway through, offering iced tea and quiet affirmations. She told them about the wallpaper, the bees, the night the power died. She told them about the voicemail from a soldier who never came home, about filtered air, and a heartbeat, and a growl that came before a cry. Danielle's eyes welled as she listened. Carter gripped her hand tighter. "It's like he just knew what to do," Carter murmured. "He always did," Leah said, "even before we believed him." Koa hadn't moved much during the conversation, just rested one paw stretched forward, his ears occasionally twitching at Isla's sighs. But now, as Danielle spoke about Arlo, about how he startled at shadows, about how no one else had wanted to meet a dog who couldn't hear danger coming, Koa did something he hadn't done all day. He let out a soft huff, not a growl, not a bark, just a sound of acknowledgement. And then he turned his head toward them, blind eyes aimed not at noise, but at energy. The couple froze. Danielle whispered, "Did he just—" "Yes," Marco said, lips twitching into something between pride and reverence. "That's his way of saying, he sees you." Silence fell, but it wasn't empty. It was full of things no one needed to say out loud, of fears quietly laid down, of a future beginning not with answers, but with yes. Before they left, Danielle knelt by Koa's side. She didn't pet him, not at first. She just placed her hand near his paw and waited. Koa didn't flinch. He nudged her wrist. 1 inch. Soft, intentional. Danielle let out a shaky laugh through tears. "We'll take Arlo," she whispered. "We'll listen like you did." Later that evening, as the sun began its slow descent and the breeze curled through the half-finished garden, Marco found Koa curled beside the crib again. But his ears didn't twitch as sharply now. He was resting deeper, peacefully, like a soldier whose post no longer needed watching every second. Leah joined him on the floor. She ran a hand along his side. "You knew they'd love him, didn't you?" Koa didn't move, but a soft thump of his tail tapped once against the wooden floor. She smiled, and for the first time in a long time, she said it aloud. "You're not just ours anymore." Outside, the first bees of spring floated past the window drawn not to fear, but to the lavender Leah had planted weeks ago. And in the room where it all began, a new kind of calm settled, not because danger had disappeared, but because love had learned how to see it coming. The fire had dwindled to amber veins. Soft crackles whispered against the quiet like a memory too gentle to fade. Shadows danced along the stone hearth in slow, flickering rhythms. The house, newly rebuilt yet already worn in with laughter and life, exhaled in silence, and Koa lay curled beside the fireplace where the heat kissed the side of his weathered body. His coat had gone grayer at the muzzle. His legs didn't carry him quite as far anymore, but the posture remained, the instinct of a sentinel. One ear always slightly lifted, just enough to catch the world. Leah sat cross-legged a few feet away, a blanket over her knees, a mug of lukewarm tea untouched in her hands. She wasn't watching the fire. She was watching him. Marco had already taken Isla to bed. The toddler had kissed Koa's head, called him Coco, and tugged softly at his ear in that clumsy, loving way only small children could get away with. He hadn't moved much, just thumped his tail once against the floor. But he knew, and he had stayed awake. Just a little longer. Leah leaned forward now, whispering as if afraid to speak too loudly might break the air. "We're safe, Koa." She reached out, touching the edge of his paw. "You did it." His breath was steady, but slower. The kind of breath that comes not from weakness, but from the knowledge that the fight has finally ended. That the house was no longer a place of warnings, that the cries in the night had softened into lullabies, that the little girl he had once stood guard over with bloodied paws and a swollen muzzle no longer needed a protector, only a presence. "You can rest now," Leah whispered. Her voice broke, barely. But it didn't fall apart. She had learned that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it curled beside you, wore scars like armor, and breathed so quietly you forgot it was once the loudest thing in the room. Koa's ears flicked once. The firelight glinted off his tag, still worn, still heavy with story. His tail lifted, tapped once against the wood floor, and then stilled. Outside, the wind shifted. Not violently, not like the storms before, just a soft rearranging of the leaves, a change in current, as if something unseen had passed through, not leaving, but finishing. Leah stayed beside him as the flames lowered themselves to sleep. She didn't cry, not yet, because this wasn't goodbye. Not really. It was a changing of form, from presence to memory, from watchfulness to legacy, from heartbeat to echo. Somewhere upstairs Isla stirred and then settled again. No growl came, no urgent scratch, only quiet. Because tonight, nothing was wrong, and for the first time in years, maybe ever, Koa let himself believe it. Hours later, long after the fire had gone out and the tea had gone cold, Marco came back down and found Leah still beside the dog. He didn't speak. He just sat beside her and laid his hand gently over hers. Together, in the hush of a home born of storms and softened by loyalty, they watched the final watch. Not with fear, not with grief, but with reverence, because some lives don't end. They settle like light in a quiet room, and some love doesn't leave. It simply rests. There are stories that stay with us long after the final word, because they remind us what loyalty truly looks like. Koa wasn't just a dog. He was a guardian, a survivor, a soul who saw with more than eyes. And in protecting a child he'd never met, in sensing danger no one else could, he reminded us that the most broken hearts often hold the deepest love. This is more than a story about bees or storms or survival. It's about second chances for a blind German shepherd labeled damaged, for a father carrying guilt, for a baby born into a world that still holds good in it. Koa's legacy doesn't end with his final breath. It lives on in every child protected, in every animal given a chance, and in every heart that learns, sometimes heroes walk on 4 legs and don't need sight to lead us home. So tonight, wherever you are, hold your pets a little closer. Trust the quiet instincts. And believe like Koa did that love is not what you see. It's what you sense, what you give, and what you leave behind when you finally rest. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering him.